Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome to another mini-series. In today's video, we will talk about the two most important blessings for a raid. So, Blessing of Kings and Blessing of Salvation. As a Paladin, it is important to understand the strengths and the limitations of all of your blessings, and this mini-series is going to be tailored around that. So without further ado, let's get right into it.
The famous original Blessing of Kings. The king of all blessings. The most important blessing for every raid member. And the first blessing of this mini-series. Now, Blessing of Kings can be obtained at level 20, as long as you put all of your first talent points into the protection tree. Although it is not something that I would personally advise you, it can be done if you want to get the buff as soon as possible. But the buff at earlier levels isn't better than Blessing of Wisdom, and therefore isn't a priority over Consecration or Seal of Command / Pursuit of Justice.
This blessing is famous for increasing a player's total stats by 10%. It costs 8% of base mana, which is about 120 mana at level 60, has a 30-yard range, is instant cast, doesn't have a cooldown, has a 5-minute duration, is categorized as a holy spell, doesn't involve any particular mechanic, and is of a magical dispel type. The base spell is free as it comes from the talent tree, but the Greater Blessing of Kings is bought at level 60 for 4 gold 60 silver, and just like any other blessing, players may only have one blessing on them per paladin at the time.
Yes, absolutely. And now let's go in game and look at what it does. So for this scenario, I am level 60 in full blue gears, as you will see on the screen, although not exactly in full pre-raid biz just yet. And I think that this is a good benchmark that most people can relate to, as it is neither too low to be irrelevant, nor too high-end for more casual players. So we can easily calculate how much stats it will give, so plus 10 strength, plus 6 agility, plus 20 stam, plus 26 intellect, and plus 16 spirit, for a total of 78 additional stats from this blessing alone. This is absolutely fantastic because I don't know if you looked at the gears that were on the screen, but the one that gives me the most stats is my chest piece with 53 total stats. This is ridiculous.
Now imagine with EQ or Nax gears. It just gets better and better because it's a percentage rather than a static buff.
Oh yes, you're right. It just gets better and better. And now, just imagine yourself as a paladin in a 40-man raid, or as any other class. You have the priests buffing Prayer of Fortitude. You have druids buffing Gift of the Wild. Mages buffing Arcane Intellect. You have your well-fed buffs. You have the Warlock's Imp buff. You have potions, elixirs, scrolls, and flasks if you're rich enough. And finally, on top of all of that, you have your Blessing of Kings.
Then you truly feel like one.
Oh yes, it's just fantastic. And when you are in a raid, you are going to use Greater Blessings, obviously. And these cost more mana, have a 40 yards range, and require a Symbol of Kings to use. And now the difference with the Greater Blessing, other than its duration, is the way you buff your teammates. It will give the buff to every party or raid member that shares the same class, meaning that you only need to target 8 people in total, 1 for each class, to get your raid fully buffed with Kings, for example. As far as the Symbols of Kings are concerned, like I said in my previous video, I personally like to have 2 full stacks in my bags to avoid running out of reagents. And when you are going to run 5-man dungeons, Blessing of Kings is not going to be as important as the environment is completely different. In a raid, like we just said, everyone has lots of buffs because they tend to save them for that occasion. But in a 5-man situation, it's not necessarily the case, so optimizing for a smoother run is going to be better.
Yeah, you don't need a bigger mana pool with Kings if you normally never go below 60% mana with Wisdom, for example.
There you go. And personally, as a 5-man healer, what I tend to do is buff Blessing of Light on the tank and Blessing of Wisdom on me. And this combo is very good to help you heal because on one end it increases your mana regeneration, and on the other, it increases the potency of your heals on the tank, who will take the most of the damage anyways, and therefore it saves you mana at the same time. And on the DPS, I will either buff Might or Wisdom, or Salvation if Threat is an issue. And now, let's talk about Blessing of Salvation. This protection spell is available at level 26 for 60 silver, and you only need to buy it once, along with its Greater Blessing for 4 gold 60 silver at level 60. Note that this blessing isn't a necessity while leveling, and its general info is just like the one for Blessing of Kings. This blessing is the second most important blessing in a raid because it reduces a player's threat by 30%, whether it comes from healing or dealing damage. And this is really important because players need to watch their threat meters to ensure that they do not steal the aggro. By reducing their threat by an astounding 30%, that means more damage or healing before reaching the same thresholds.
While this blessing alone isn't the magical solution for threat problems, as every player is responsible for its own threat if they want to keep the tank happy, we're looking at you hunters, it is still a very valuable buff that mostly everyone, except the tanks obviously, should have.
Exactly, and classes with aggro reducing abilities such as rogues and hunters don't need it as much, but high DPS warlocks definitely need it, even over all the other buffs sometimes. Now you might be asking yourself, but Alex, what if you have a feral druid tank in your raid and you want to give salvation to the restore druids? Or if you have a protection warrior but you want to buff your fury warriors? What do you do? Because the tanks obviously do not want reduced threat, but the greater blessing will be applied to everyone that shares the same class. Well, it's quite easy. In that case, you can buff the warriors and the druids with salvation, but then immediately cast Blessing of Sacrifice on the tanks to remove salvation, as the new blessing will remove the old one. And tanks can also use an add-on called Block Salvation to remove it automatically from them. And if you are the paladin assigned to buffing salvation, it is important to be aware of the fight's mechanics, because some fights will require you to not buff salvation on specific classes or people. For example, are your hunters going to kite mobs during that fight? If so, then you do not buff the hunters, and so on. And in a 5-man dungeon scenario, then salvation isn't as important, just like in the case of Blessing of Kings. Depending on the party's composition, salvation might even be useless.
If your DPS are not all that geared, then it is not necessary. If your group is just breezing through the run and mobs die really fast, as it happens when you start getting a lot of AQ and Naxxramas gears for example, then it is also not necessary.
There you go. And generally, I only buff salvation on warlocks in 5-men because they can pull a lot of threat very easily, or I buff it later if I see that the tank has problem with threat or if the DPS is just simply too high.
And that's it for this video, guys. We hope that you've enjoyed and learned something today, as knowing your blessing is a crucial part of playing the Paladin class. And definitely stay tuned for the next video that will be about Blessing of Protection and Blessing of Freedom, who are quite different from the other blessings. And as always, your support is greatly appreciated, so hit that like, subscribe, and all that good stuff, and we will see us in the next one. So until next time, guys.
Have a good one!
And stay blessed.